Alright, so listen, the Bleach power scaling community has devised a bunch of different methods for scaling the verse, such as scaling Soul Society at Ichigo to multi-solar system level and hundreds of times faster than light. Within this video, I plan to explain the problems I have with 10 different Bleach metas in order to justify why I personally won't use them in future videos. The metas are ordered by the amount of stuff I have to explain, which means that the first meta I will go over will be the shortest one, while the last meta will be the longest. Moreover, this video is structured in a way so that I'll first give a brief rundown of the meta before explaining my contentions with it. I'm only going to go over 10 different metas because it would take way too long to go over every single meta Bleach has, and with just 10 you can see this video is already over an hour long, and it took over a week to fully research, write, revise, record, and edit this video. The 10 metas within this videos are either ones that I used to use or one that people currently use and I am interested in discussing. Thus, I want you all to comment on a specific meta that I missed, and if I get over 10 new metas, I might do a part 2, though there's no guarantee to that. If you have questions about something specific within this video, then you can either comment it or DM me on Instagram. But if you have contentions with my debunk of a specific meta and want to have a whole debate with me, then we'll have to get into a call. But before we do so, it should be noted that due to personal preference, I don't debate in groups or with judges. Moreover, don't come at me like I just disrespected your entire lineage or something, because it really ain't that serious. It's just power scaling fictional characters. I say it because I debate people who straight up get heated because I disagree with them and begin insulting me. So if you're not that type of timing, I'm gonna just leave the call, because for one, I ain't just gonna tolerate some random person talking to me like that. And if I try to insult them back or some, then it just becomes a whole clowning session instead of a debate about fictional characters, and that's just saying it. If you're the type of person that fits the aforementioned criteria, then just make a post or a video explaining why you disagree with what I said, and I'll respond to it either by admitting that I'm wrong or countering your claims in a follow-up video or post. Either way, I'm not gonna debate someone who fits the aforementioned criteria. But with all that out of the way, let's get into it. This meta has a basis in the Bleach Unmasked databook, where it stated that an ability called Infinite Ammunition Hollow Flash or Zero Metralletas allows Starrk to shoot an infinite number of zeros. Given that in the Souls databook, it stated that zeros are just beams of spiritual pressure, the meta goes that Starrk would require an infinite amount of spiritual pressure in order to fire an infinite amount of zeros. Therefore, he scales to high universe level, and so would anyone who scales off of him. Here's my contentions. Firstly, the actual kanji that is used isn't the kanji for Mugen, which means infinite. If not, it's the kanji for Musu, which means countless or innumerable, which are words that are often used hyperbolically in order to explain something being very massive. For example, I could say that there are countless stars in the sky, or there are innumerable planets within the universe. Doesn't mean that it's infinite, it just means that there's a lot, which is how those terms are used. Secondly, there are more than several characters that are stronger than Starrk. You have Aizen, Ichigo, Yhwach, Yamamoto, etc. This is a problem because if one character has infinite spiritual pressure, then others cannot have more spiritual pressure than this character, since it would be implying that one infinity is larger than another, which doesn't work with magnitude, since if a magnitude is infinite, then it means that it has no end in its magnitudes. If you say another magnitude is larger than it, then you are imposing a limit onto the smaller magnitude, thus going directly against the idea of infinity. There are other problems with this meta, but there's no need to point out all of them. The basis of this meta lies on multiple different statements and panels. The first is that in chapter 72, it's shown that the Seireitei is made up of 4 different gates. In chapter 76, it's stated by Yoruichi that it takes 10 days to travel in between each gate. Therefore, under the presumption that they are walking at average human speed and are resting, eating, and doing other things for 8 hours a day, it puts the circumference of the Seireitei at near 3,500 kilometers, with a radius slightly above 550 kilometers, with there being ways to get it higher. People then try to scale off of this and say that the Soul King's palace has a height nearing 60 kilometers, and Ichigo destroying a massive portion of the structure is actually a large island level feat. Here's my contentions. Firstly, the main problem with trying to scale a structure based on statements is that it can be contradicted by the visuals. In chapters 72 and 74, Ichigo is shown to be comparable in size to Jindabo, as Jindabo doesn't dwarf him in any significant manner such as a human and an ant. Jindabo is then comparable in size to one of the entrances to the Seireitei, as they do not dwarf him in a manner that is similar to how a skyscraper would dwarf a person, and his reaching height seems to be rivaling the height of the wall itself. In the Bleach Souls databook, it's stated that Jindabo has a height rivaling 10 meters, so let's be incredibly generous and say that the wall is 100 meters tall. At this height, it would be taller than both Big Ben and the Statue of Liberty. Even with this generous estimate, the Seireitei's size doesn't even rival 6 kilometers, let alone near 100-fold of that value. Even if you were to say that the gates are a kilometer high, the Seireitei would still fall short of 60 kilometers. It should be noted that I'm not saying the Seireitei has a diameter that is less than 6 kilometers. What I am saying is that the size is too inconsistent to assert it being dozens, if not hundreds of kilometers wide. Secondly, in chapters 618 through 620, alongside some other ones I don't quite remember, we see that Ichigo and company are comparable in size to the poles that surround the palace. The reason this is significant is because these poles aren't insanely dwarfed by the palace itself. We see that the thickness of the destroyed chunks don't completely dwarf the size of the characters, and this thickness isn't dwarfed to the extent that it should be by the structure itself. This goes to show that the size of the structure is nowhere near dozens of kilometers. Allow me to reiterate the fact that I'm not saying that the Soul King's palace is just a few hundred meters tall. What I am saying is that it's nowhere near the dozens of kilometers people put it at. Moreover, there are many other ways to attack this meta about the Soul King's palace, but there's no need to talk about it any further. A few things that should be noted is that Versus Battle Wiki has an extremely detailed pixel calc that puts either the diameter or the radius of the Seireitei between 60 and 140 kilometers. And there are other statements within the movies that I believe to be non-canon that put the Seireitei's size at like 600 miles. But as I showed, this statement is contradicted numerous times, thus cannot be used. Moreover, you can get even smaller and put the Seireitei's size at less than a kilometer because of a specific scan, but it isn't consistent with the other shots of the Seireitei, and it wouldn't make much sense anyways. Plus, I think there are counter arguments against it. This meta has a basis in chapter 420, where Aizen states that he evolved to a plane that is beyond that of Shinigami and humans, similar to how two-dimensional beings transcend three-dimensional beings, with Ichigo transcending Aizen to the same degree, as Aizen states that Ichigo is in a higher dimension than himself. Coupling this with statements from the Unmasked data book such as the Hongyoku transforming Aizen into a being that transcends everything, which would include the other realms which are space-times, Aizen transcending reason, Ichigo possessing power that transcends everything, etc., people tend to claim that Aizen is a fourth-dimensional being if not transcends dimensionality as a whole, while Ichigo is a fifth-dimensional being or also transcends dimensionality as a whole. Here's my contentions. Firstly, I'll attack the idea of Aizen and Ichigo being transcendent of everything. The main problem with these statements is that they're contradicted by the fact that both Aizen and Ichigo in the 1000-year Blood War arc are stated to be superior to their Arrancar arc counterparts. Thus, they discredit the validity of the statement since it means that they don't transcend their future selves or other characters in the future, which would be included in the term everything. Another thing is that the claim of transcending everything really means transcending everything if you take the verbatim as true. This would mean transcending dimensionality itself, which is contradicted by the fact that both Aizen and Ichigo are shown to have forms and physical existence. It would also include the ability to transcend the ideas of death and defeat, which clearly isn't the case since Aizen was overpowered by Ichigo and defeated by Urahara. Moreover, it stated that Final Getsuga Tensho Ichigo is stronger than Aizen by Aizen himself, so it goes to show that Aizen doesn't transcend everything as Ichigo is something he doesn't transcend. I could go on and on about why these statements about Ichigo and Aizen transcending everything don't make any sense, but there's no need since I believe I've already justified the fact that they were most likely used hyperbolically. Secondly, Aizen and Ichigo cannot be higher dimensional beings because it's shown that stronger iterations of the characters can be perceived by three-dimensional beings who can also interact with them. A good example of this is in chapter 583 where Ichigo and Candace clash, which isn't something that should be possible if Ichigo was truly made up of an additional dimension. A more detailed refutation would be that what Aizen said shouldn't be taken as the verbatim. The reason for this is that in the page that directly precedes Aizen's statement of Ichigo being in another dimension than himself, He implies that Ichigo's strength has grown so much that the difference between himself and Ichigo is similar to the difference between a previous iteration of himself with Isshin and company. In other words, Aizen couldn't sense Ichigo in the same way weaker beings couldn't sense Aizen due to the vast difference in spiritual pressure. That is why Aizen goes on to give the analogy of two-dimensional entities being unable to perceive two-dimensional entities when explaining why his strength couldn't be sensed by weaker entities. Moreover, in chapter 418, Ichigo uses the term dimension as a synonym for level or tier, which Aizen understands and responds by implying that his power is still far greater than Ichigo's. So what does all of this mean? It means that the statements are more of a figurative nature than literal, and all Aizen meant when he said that Ichigo is in a higher dimension than himself is that Ichigo became insanely stronger. It had nothing to do with dimensional transcendence, and Aizen himself doesn't transcend anyone other than first and second dimensional beings. This meta has a basis in the third Can't Fear Your Own World novel, where it's stated that the Soul King is a being that transcends everything. People try to use this statement to claim that the Soul King is either a higher dimensional being or the strongest entity in existence with every hack that can be conceptualized. Here's my contentions. Firstly, novels or any literary material for that matter tends to use figures of speech and literary devices in order for the reading experience to be enjoyable rather than every single word being the literal meaning. This is something that is especially present in Bleach as seen with the previous metas that precede this one, such as the previous one where both Ichigo and Aizen had statements of themselves transcending everything which were used in a figurative manner. So it's unlikely that this statement was meant to be literal and the Soul King is the strongest being in fiction or some. Secondly, there's a statement made by the character who's given the explanation of the world's history where they say that the Soul King was very close to omnipotent and omnipresent, which is in direct contradiction with the statement that he transcends everything. Moreover, this is another example of figurative language in the exact same novel that makes the statement that this meta is based on, since there's no such thing as being very close to omnipotence, because omnipotence is absoluteness and you can't be close to absoluteness, since it would be similar to saying you're close to infinity itself. You either are or aren't. This statement is obviously trying to say that the Soul King was such a powerful being that you could describe him using the word omnipotent. Of course, you could just say that this statement has less validity than the one this meta is based on, since the latter is made by the author while the prior is made by a character, but just keep this in mind as it works as supporting evidence. Thirdly, it is stated that the Soul King's right and left arm ruled over the principles of stillness and advancement. This doesn't make sense to me because if he transcends everything, then why does each one of his arms just serve such a weak idea when in comparison to totality itself? Like if you transcend everything, then it means you transcend the idea of being defeated. Why isn't one of his arms governing over principles such as dimensionality, absolutism, causality, existence, etc.? Again, this isn't a direct refutation if not just supporting evidence. Lastly, the whole reason this statement doesn't work is because of the inherent problems with claims of omnipotence. You see, this statement about the Soul King transcending everything is a claim of omnipotence, since if you take it at face value, you can basically go, the Soul King transcends everything and insert X concept is something, thus he transcends it. Due to this, you can be like, omnipotence is something, therefore he transcends it. In other words, if this statement is true, then the Soul King should be capable of doing anything. This should thus mean that he can also create a material that he himself cannot destroy. But how can he create a material that he cannot destroy? If he can do everything, then surely he can destroy this object he created. But if he can destroy it, then it means that he can't create something he cannot destroy. That's the inherent problem with the idea of being able to do anything. You create impossible scenarios which result in a logical contradiction. Taking into consideration everything I just said, I believe this statement about the Soul King was just hyperbolical, as there have been statements in the past that have the exact same wording and are used to express a character having a vast amount of strength. And think about it for a second. It's either the Soul King is the strongest being in fiction that both controls and is unbounded by any and every idea that humanity can conceptualize within the real world, or that it's just a hyperbolic statement used to exemplify his vast power. I think we can all agree that the latter makes more sense and is more likely. Another thing is that the reason the Soul King will have to be the strongest being in fiction for this statement to be true, ignoring the inherent problems with it of course, is that he would also have to transcend the idea of being able to do everything, since if he cannot do everything, that's something he doesn't transcend, which would directly contradict the statement. In other words, I believe this matter doesn't work because it delves into the inherent problems with claims of omnipotence, and it's most likely just a use of figurative language, as we've had statements like this in the past that were used figuratively, as speech in general integrates figures of speech, which is something that is even more prevalent in literature. This meta has a basis in chapter 131, where it's stated in Aizen's letter to Hinamori that the Sokyoku has the destructive power of 1,000,000 Zanpakuto, which can be amplified tenfold, and Toshiro plans to use it to destroy not only the Seireitei, but the entire Soul Society. Using this statement, you can then find the size of the Soul Society and argue that Soul Society or Ichigo is between planet level and universe level. Here's my contentions. Firstly, based on what is shown to us, almost every aspect of this letter was capped and was later disproven. One of the only things that wasn't was the statement about the Sokyoku. Given that in one of the Can't Fear Your Own World novels, it stated that Aizen lies for sport, is it not plausible that the statement about the Sokyoku is just Aizen lying about Toshiro in order to have Hinamori fight him? While I don't think it's ever explained why Aizen wrote the letter to Hinamori, the common belief is that Aizen did it in order for Toshiro and Hinamori to kill each other in battle, as stated by Toshiro. This makes sense because in the same statement that says Aizen lies for sport, it goes on to say that Aizen doesn't say things without a purpose. We know Aizen directed the letter to Hinamori as the message itself is directed to her, alongside it being stated in both the manga and Soul's databook. We also know that Hinamori greatly admired Aizen as it stated in the Soul's databook, thus it's likely she would believe anything he says. Supporting this is that Hinamori believed Toshiro was going to steal the Sokyoku in order to destroy the Soul Society to such an extent that she didn't want to listen to anything anyone said, which is both stated in the databook and shown when she fights Toshiro, who states that she is in a clear state of mind to think logically, all because it was what Aizen said. In the same databook, it's also stated that Aizen falsified the letter, which could imply that its contents are lies. It also goes on to mention that a bunch of events that seem to have no meaning go on to form a thread that outlines Aizen's plan, which is to execute Rukia in order to steal the Hongyoku from within her. The letter to Hinamori fits that description, and I believe it's unlikely that Aizen just wanted to kill Hinamori and Toshiro just because he hated them or something. There must have been an important reason as to why he wanted both of them to kill themselves in battle if we assume Toshiro's hypothesis to be accurate. While it doesn't directly show that Aizen was lying, it goes to show that it is extremely likely and puts into question the validity of the statement about the Sokyoku. What solidifies the fact that Aizen was lying is that the statement about the Sokyoku itself is later contradicted. Secondly, the statement claims that the Sokyoku has the destructive capability of 1,000,000 Zanpakuto, and at full power it's amplified tenfold. This means that at full power, the Sokyoku has a destructive capability of 10,000,000 Zanpakuto, which is supposedly enough to destroy the Soul Society. Even though there are arguments for the Soul Society being universal in size, just for argument's sake, let's say that the Soul Society is just a planet. This puts the Sokyoku's destructive capability at just above planet level if we assume that the Soul Society is around the size of Earth. The reason this is for argument's sake is that the lower the Sokyoku scales, the more beneficial it will be in countering the argument I'm about to make. Anyways, given planet level is around 60 zetatons of TNT, the statement about the Sokyoku implies that each Zanpakuto has the destructive capability of 6 petatons of TNT, which is multi-continent level. Yet, in chapter 418, a transcendent Aizen, who is one of the strongest characters in the verse, implies that destroying a mountain is supposed to be impressive. I'm not saying that Aizen just scales at mountain level or anything like that, since attack potency and destructive capability are two different metrics. But in this situation, we are specifically talking about destructive capability. If just one Zanpakuto can obliterate entire continents, there should have been absolutely no reason for Aizen to make that statement, since he should literally scale millions of times above that. While I have yet to get into it, within this video I'll explain why Las Noches isn't as large as people think it is, but even on the high end, people have it at around the size of a state. Yet it's supposed to be impressive to destroy this structure. We also see that Ulquiorra's Lanza del Relámpagos' destructive capability is supposed to be impressive, but that attack isn't destroying continents. There are multiple different counter-arguments you could make to justify the destruction of Las Noches, and Lanza del Relámpago being about an amount of energy rather than destructive capability. But in my opinion, it was obvious that it was about area of effect and destructive capability, especially when you consider that Aizen implied that destroying a mountain is supposed to be impressive. In conclusion, I believe this method doesn't work because it's extraordinarily more likely that Aizen just lied to Hinamori about the Sokyoku rather than his statement being true, as his statement isn't consistent with later feats and it just doesn't make sense in general when you look at the narrative and other statements that are made. This matter has two different bases. The first is in chapter 248, where Nell states that it takes 3 days to walk to the main entrance of Las Noches, which people use to assert that Las Noches is around the length of Florida, if not larger. The second is that Las Noches is actually a pocket reality, as in chapter 294, it is shown to have a sky with a sun which is supported by statements in one of the data books. Going off of that premise, there are arguments that Las Noches is actually a planet because in chapter 383, you can see a curvature. People then try to use this and say that given Ulquiorra's resurrection is stated to be able to destroy Las Noches, Ulquiorra himself scales anywhere between country level and star level. Here's my contentions. Firstly, Nell's statement is contradicted by the visuals countless different times. The best example of this is in chapter 345, where it's shown that Ulquiorra's height is comparable to the size of one of the poles that are at the top of Las Noches. Then in chapter 347, we see that those poles can then be compared to Las Noches itself. Using some quick pixel scaling, we arrive at the conclusion that Las Noches has a length nearing 5.6 kilometers. The problem with this pixel scaling is that it's contradicted by Nell's statement, and it taking them 3 days to travel that minuscule distance doesn't make any sense unless they're literally walking at the speed of a snail. Moreover, this size scaling is contradicted by other visuals of Las Noches, such as these two shots in chapter 351, which puts its size between 9 and 14 kilometers. So what now? Based on everything I just explained, any statement, visual, or implication of the size of Las Noches will be contradicted by something else. There is no one thing that isn't contradicted by something else. Since the reason Las Noches' size is important is because it's used for power scaling those that scale to the destruction of it, the best you can do is use the low end and say that the length is unquantifiably above 5.6 kilometers. Any other scaling is contradicted by this value, but based on what I've seen, this is the lowest, therefore the true yield of the amount of energy required to destroy Las Noches will just be unquantifiably above this value, unless there's a way to calculate the size of Las Noches being lower than the aforementioned value, i.e. 5.6 kilometers. Secondly, I'll talk about the sky, sunlight, and curvature. For one, it's shown and stated that the sky is fake and it is not that far away from the ground, so it's obvious that the star within Las Noches is also fake unless it's just like a few dozen meters across or something. This is something that is straight up stated in the Unmasked data book. Secondly, that curvature could just be a use of an omnidirectional camera shot or just a camera shot that has a wider field of view. Plus, that curvature is not an indication that it's a planet, since at the height of the shot we can clearly see Byakuya and Kenpachi who aren't colossal beings. This means that it would be impossible for said curvature to be like that of the Earth, since to even see the curvature of the Earth, you have to be like 10 kilometers in the air. Moreover, when you zoom in, it doesn't appear to be a curvature, if not just one of those taller structures alongside a small hill which there's an abundance of within Las Noches as seen in chapter 282. Thirdly, in chapter 245, Ichigo and company were running for a long time without it seeming that they are getting any closer to Las Noches. This is something people try to use to say that Las Noches is very massive. The problem with this is that within the mass data book, it stated that the size of Las Noches confuses the sense of distance of anyone who looks at it, which is also stated in chapter 244 of the manga. Thus it's likely that Ichigo and company were just confused on how far away they were from Las Noches, so when they actually began running, it appeared to them as if they didn't travel any distance. Lastly, people tend to say that the inside of Las Noches appears to be larger than the outside, but the problem with this is that it's possible that the walls or edges of certain areas are painted similar to the ceiling where it appears to extend far further than it actually does. Think about it for a second. Uyu didn't notice that the sky was fake until Ulquiorra broke through the canopy of Las Noches, meaning that it originally appeared to him as if it extended endlessly just like the sky on Earth. Using the same technique or technology, is it not possible that they did the same thing to the walls? Of course, there's no way to prove this, it is more so something that should be thought of. Either way, it doesn't make sense for Las Noches to be larger in the inside than the outside, since it straight up doesn't make any sense, and I don't think there's a specific scan within the manga that does show that the inside of Las Noches is larger. It's more so specific shots that appear to display a larger area, which isn't conclusive enough to say that the inside of Las Noches is larger than the outside. In conclusion, I believe this meta doesn't work because Nell's statement is contradicted on numerous different occasions, and Las Noches having a star or a planet just doesn't make any sense, as the manga, anime, and data book straight up debunk it. This meta has a basis in chapter 578, where Grammy is stated to have created outer space with his sacred letter or skiff called Visionary. Coupling this with visuals at the end of chapters and statements in the novels, people tend to say that Grammy scales anywhere between multi-solar system level and universe level. Before I get into explaining my contentions, there are a few things that have to be explained. Firstly, I'll explain exactly what a sacred letter is before going on to explain Visionary. According to chapter 500 and 565, when the Stern Rider was created, most of them drank Yhwach's blood, which enabled him to carve a part of his soul into the Stern Riders that took the form as a letter. This letter is known as a sacred letter, which gives the Stern Rider a unique ability. Based on that explanation alone, it's already evident that the Stern Riders wouldn't scale to whatever unique ability they possess, since a sacred letter is the ability to produce an effect and isn't just a raw exertion of spiritual pressure. For example, let's say one of the abilities the Stern Rider gains is the ability to divide any body of matter they touch in half. So if they touch a planet, the planet will be divided in two, thus destroyed. Does this mean that the Stern Rider in question physically scales to the destruction of the planet or possesses enough spiritual pressure in order to destroy the planet? No, it just means that they have the ability that allows them to destroy objects via dividing them. It doesn't mean that they themselves are exerting raw energy for the effect to occur. Another example is teleportation. If a Stern Rider teleports a star outside the solar system, it doesn't mean that they scale to the amount of energy needed to accelerate the star away from its original position unless it's implied to work that way. Secondly, in chapter 572, it stated that Visionary is an ability that allows Grammy to turn fantasy into reality, which translates into him being able to imagine anything and it happening. So if he imagines that a person becomes a door, then that person will probably become a door. Thus, when he fought Kenpachi, he imagined outer space, which caused it to be materialized. Now for my contentions. The problem with this meta is proving that Grammy scales to anything he creates, since just because you create something doesn't mean that you scale to the mass energy equivalence or some of that nature of the object in question. I made an entire post on my IG that I will turn into a video sometime in the future, but the basic conclusion was that you wouldn't scale to something you can create unless you can prove that there's a relationship between the amount of energy the character expends and the amount of matter that is created. This means that if a character creates a planet but the ratio between the amount of energy that is used versus the amount of matter that is created is like 1 to 1 billion, then the character in question wouldn't scale to planet level or whatever you count that feat to, if not to 1/1 billionth of that value. Even if you can prove the aforementioned, you'd also have to prove that they can use that same energy they're using to create the object in question to destroy. In Bleach's case, it will be proven that the amount of spiritual pressure he used to create these celestial bodies rival the amount he can use for his physical attacks or something similar to that. The reason for this being that we know that characters within Bleach have an overall amount of spiritual pressure and an amount they can use at any instance, with the overall amount being something akin to stamina. A prime example of this is when the Visors were trying to measure Ichigo's overall amount of spiritual pressure. Moreover, we know that there are attacks that are more powerful than others, thus it's likely that they draw more spiritual pressure than others, such as a Gran Rey Zero or Cero Oscuras. In basic terms, the argument that refutes this meta is that you cannot prove Grammy was directly transferring his spiritual pressure into physical, or in this case spiritual, matter. Don't confuse this with just spiritual pressure being involved in the process. Prove that Visionary just works as a converter between spiritual pressure and matter rather than Grammy requiring spiritual pressure in order to activate his ability. Something supporting that Grammy isn't directly transforming spiritual pressure into matter, if not just using spiritual pressure to produce an effect, is Visionary's ability to do things such as amping Grammy's strength in chapter 578. This is something that implies that he can create things he doesn't physically scale to, and it should be impossible since you cannot use a lesser amount of something to create a greater amount of something else without assistance. It would be like using the number 10 to create the number 20 without any additional help or input. It doesn't make any sense, and it just goes to show that Grammy's Visionary is an ability that produces an effect and isn't a direct transfer of spiritual pressure or anything else like that. It likely just uses spiritual pressure to activate the ability, which produces an effect, as all abilities in Bleach do, or most of them. In conclusion, I believe this method doesn't work because you cannot prove that he is directly transferring his spiritual pressure into an amount of matter rather than just using his spiritual pressure to produce an effect. As we know that sacred letters are things that you do not inherently scale to due to the way they are defined. Supporting this notion is that Grimmy was able to amplify his strength, which shouldn't be possible if he was just using raw spiritual pressure. This matter has a basis in the Bleach Memories of Nobody movie, where a pocket reality known as a Valley of Screams is formed between the Soul Society and the living world, whose existence threatens to destroy the aforementioned realms. Within the pocket reality, it is shown that there is a blue sky, thus the presumption is that it has a star within it. This pocket reality is destroyed by something known as the Kido Cannon, which is seemingly powered by several dozen Shinigami. The argument goes that several dozen Shinigamis have enough spiritual pressure to destroy a pocket reality that contains a star, thus any character scaling above these further Shinigami would be around star level if not higher. Here's my contentions. Firstly, we never actually see a star within this dimension, we just see a blue sky. Some may argue that the reason why the sky is blue in real life is because of the radiation given off by the sun, and while this is true, we know that within Bleach there are things such as artificial skies as seen with Las Noches. So whether or not there is a sky within this pocket reality is questionable, and while this point doesn't directly refute the notion, it has to be said before moving on to the next one. Secondly, it's stated that Senna is at the center of this pocket reality, which doesn't make sense because if she's on a planet that is orbited by a star, then she should be far away from the center, given the star or planet's core will be at the center, though I can see there being another explanation. Thirdly, there's a shot of the supposed planet and we can clearly see it curving at a distance that is not that far away from Senna's location, which is supposed to be the center of the pocket reality. This means that the size of this supposed planet is nowhere near the size of even the moon, let alone the Earth. Fourthly, when Mayuri represents this pocket reality with a hologram, he doesn't represent it as a sphere if not just a mountainous region, which may imply that it's not a planet and the curvature is just a warp camera shot since we're shown two different shots that have vastly different curvatures. It should be noted that as time goes on, the curvature of the pocket reality changes, so it's possible that it got smaller as it was pulling the Soul Society and living world together, causing the gravitational force of both realms to crush it. If this is true, then it means that when it was destroyed by the Kido Cannon, it was at the smallest it's ever been. Fifthly, on multiple different occasions, it appears as if the branches of the white tree looking thing that houses Senna only extends up to a certain height and it seemingly attaches itself to the sky. Given Senna is at the center, it would imply the dimension isn't that large, and the rest of the dimension that we see might be some sort of mirage, similar to how it appeared the sky extends far further than it actually does. Sixthly, when the Kido Cannon is fired, we see that the sky itself seemingly collapsed, which is reminiscent of when Ichigo and Ulquiorra broke through the canopy of Las Noches. We also see some sort of slime-like substance ooze out of the sky itself. This supports the notion that it was some sort of fake or artificial sky. Lastly, it cannot be proven that the entirety of the dimension was going to be destroyed by just energy. You see, this meta assumes that a bunch of father Shinigami are powering the Kido Cannon, which shoots out a projectile made of spiritual pressure. This projectile then creates an omnidirectional explosion or something akin to it, so that the spiritual pressure releases enough energy that it obliterates all of the contents of this pocket reality. The problem with this is that it isn't stated anywhere and we have no idea how the dimension was going to be destroyed. So you can assert it was solely due to the vast amount of spiritual pressure, and anyone whose spiritual pressure exceeds that amount will scale above the destruction of the pocket reality. Moreover, the weapon in question itself is called the Kido Cannon, and we see that the ones powering it are members of the Kido Corps. Thus it's safe to deduce that this weapon has some sort of relationship with Kido. My guess is that it's a weapon that functions as a vessel for a Kido spell. What I mean by this is that given Kido draw a large amount of spiritual pressure to produce an effect, the Kido Cannon is a machine that creates the spell, but in order for the spell to be activated, it requires a lot of spiritual power alongside a long incantation. Given the Kido Cannon shoots out an attack that can destroy pocket realities, we can deduce that it's a Hado, which are offensive spells. In the Mass Data book, it stated that the effectiveness of spells depend on the user, and in this case, the user wouldn't be the Shinigami themselves if not the Kido Cannon. This means that the Kido Cannon would be able to create an attack whose effectiveness far exceeds that of the combined forces of the members of the Kido Corps that powered it. But at the end of the day, this is just an explanation that isn't concrete. Either way, it's impossible to prove the assumption this meta makes, therefore it doesn't work. In conclusion, I believe this method doesn't work because you cannot prove that the pocket reality was going to be destroyed as a result of just spiritual pressure, and the size of the realm itself is nowhere near the size of a solar system, let alone a planet or a satellite such as the moon. Something else I wanted to point out while editing this video is that why didn't one of the captains just power the Kido cannon instantaneously, because the amount of spiritual pressure they possess is like far greater than the ones possessed by the members of the Kido Corps. Like, Yamamoto could have just touched the cannon and powered it instantaneously and just have it ready to fire at like any given moment rather than waiting for the Kido Corps to power it. Like, that just doesn't make any sense to me. This matter has a basis in chapters 664, 680, 684, and others where there are multiple statements of Yhwach talking about he's going to destroy the Soul Society, Mundo, and the living world. People tend to scale the size of these realms ranging from anywhere between just being a planet all the way up to being their own universes. If what Yhwach is saying is true, then it will put him between planet and universe level. There are also some people that say the Soul Society and the living world are separate space-times. Therefore, it would amp Yhwach's feet up to low multiverse level. Before I go on to explain my contentions, there are a few things that needs to be understood. Firstly, in the third Can't Fear Your Own World novel, it's explained that at one point in time, all of creation was in a state of ambiguity where there was neither life nor death, and progression and regression flickered to and from while the world was supposedly increasing and decreasing in size. This will continue for 100 million years before the world would cool down, and eventually hollows became a part of the soul cycle. However, it didn't take long until hollows began devouring humans, which caused the circulation to cease, as it appears that all souls in existence combined into one menos grande. This caused the world to become completely still, which I'm presuming means that there was no cycling of souls. But then a being came into existence who was rejected by the natural world. This being was the Soul King, and it appeared as if he destroyed the menos grande, causing it to become nothing more than a mass of spiritual sand, which led to the re-emergence of the cycle of souls. Alongside the Soul King, there were others who appeared and possessed special powers, but the Soul King stood out since his powers were near omnipotence and omnipresence. The Soul King then began annihilating hollows in order to protect others and stop the world from entering stagnation, i.e. to maintain the cycle of souls. Due to the Soul King's actions, the world will slowly sink into chaos. Why? I don't know, it's never explained. Either way, there were 5 people who did not agree with the current state of the world. These people were strong, but not as strong as the Soul King, and were the founders of the 5 great noble houses. Each of them had their own reason for disagreeing with the current state of the world. Some were afraid that the Soul King would use his powers against them, while others believed it would be better to purify hollows rather than outright destroying them. Either way, it all led to one conclusion: to split the current world. There would be a world of Kinshi, a world of Reishi, and also a sand paradise that would be the destination for the hollows both worlds produced. It is said that maybe another form of the world will be born, but what was necessary was a distinction between the world of the living and the world of the dead. In order for this separation to become a reality, they required the powers of the Soul King, who was tied up and sealed within a crystal. Then, using his almighty powers as a keystone, the foundations of the new world were created. This new world consisted of the Soul Society, Mundo, and the living world. With life and death finally separated, a new era was ushered in due to the soul cycle. Moving on, in chapter 46, it's explained that Quincy's were killing off hollows in the living world rather than sending them to Mundo. This led to a disruption in the soul cycle, and if it continued, it would have damaged the equilibrium of souls and caused both the Soul Society and the living world to collide with each other and be destroyed. In chapter 615, Yhwach explained that the Soul King was created by the Soul Society to basically stabilize the flow of souls traveling in and out of the Soul Society. Thus, with the Soul King gone, the living world, the Soul Society, Dagai, and Mundo would collapse and return to their original form. To summarize everything I just explained, the world was originally just one large universe, but they wanted to separate it for a variety of different reasons. Due to this, the Soul King was sealed and his powers were used to divide the world, which resulted in the creation of the Soul Society, the living world, and Mundo. This division created a massive traffic of souls to and from the Soul Society, so they used the Soul King to stabilize it. This stabilization would basically be regulating the travel of souls, and you can think of it as being somewhat similar to how traffic lights, road signs, road bumps, and other stuff like that manages cars. The amount of souls within the Soul Society and the living world will have to remain at an equilibrium. Otherwise, it will cause both worlds to collide and collapse, where life and death will no longer be distinguished. The same thing would happen if the Soul King stopped regulating the cycle of souls. Now we move on to explaining Yhwach's goal. In chapter 686, Yhwach talks about how the realms should have become one and were destined to be combined as one. In the third Can't Fear Your Own World novel, it stated that if Ichigo didn't defeat Yhwach, the boundary between the three worlds would have disappeared, and things would return to the way they were prior to the division of the world, which would have reduced the history of the Soul Society to nothing. Moreover, at some point in one of the three novels, it stated that Yhwach wanted to turn the world the way it was prior to the Soul King dividing it. Based on everything I've explained, there's absolutely no reason to believe Yhwach would have completely destroyed all of the world with his spiritual pressure in a direct sense, since his plan was to create no distinction between life and death, which would have basically been undoing what the Soul King was used to create all of those years ago. In one of the Can't Fear Your Own World novels, it straight up stated that if Yhwach's plan was realized, reality would have resembled its old self before the Soul Society was born. If Yhwach was truly going to destroy all of the realms with his spiritual pressure, it would directly go against what he said at the end of his life, since without existence, there wouldn't be any life or death, there would just be nothingness. It also wouldn't make sense for him to fight Ichigo and everyone else who he fought, since the moment he defeated Ichigo or right after absorbing the Soul King, he could have just destroyed everything. It makes far more sense for Yhwach having been wanting to undo the division the Soul King performed, rather than straight up destroying all of the realms and killing everyone and everything. In conclusion, I believe this method doesn't work because Yhwach had no reason to actually destroy the realms with his strength in a direct sense. If not, he planned to remove the boundary between worlds and disrupt the cycle of souls. This would have caused the realms to revert to the way they were previously, where there was no differentiation between life and death. This meta has a basis in both the manga and data books, which have a multitude of different statements about specific abilities, being beams of light or something akin to it, such as the Zero and Negación. People use these statements to say that since these abilities are light, they are moving at the speed of light, and anyone who scales to these abilities would also scale to the speed of light. Before I get into explaining my contentions, there are a few things that have to be explained. Firstly, vacuum permittivity is basically the resistance of free space against the formation of electric fields, while vacuum permeability is the same concept but applied to magnetic fields. Moving on, all atoms possess electric charges, which themselves possess electric fields. According to Faraday's law, when a magnetic field moves, it creates an electric field, while Ampere's law states that when an electric field moves, it creates a magnetic field. This then creates a continuous cycle of electric fields creating magnetic fields and magnetic fields creating electric fields. In other words, it creates a self-propagating electromagnetic wave whose speed is inversely proportional to the permeability and permittivity of free space. These values for vacuum permeability and permittivity are inherent aspects of reality, and we don't know why their values are what they are, but since they are constants that define the rate at which electric and magnetic fields can interact with each other in the real world, these values set a limit on how fast electromagnetic waves can propagate through free space. This limit is then what we now know as the speed of light, and it made us understand that light is a manifestation of electric and magnetic waves, i.e. an electromagnetic wave. Secondly, I'll briefly explain what photons are. Photons are elementary particles that are massless. Due to this, they always travel at the speed of light in a vacuum. Photons are essential to the study of electromagnetism, as they are involved in all electromagnetic interaction. The light that we can see is known as visible light, which is electromagnetic radiation that can be perceived by humans. Thirdly, causality within the context of general and special relativity is basically the relationship between cause and effect, where an effect cannot occur before the cause. Thus, the cause for an event must be in the past light cone. Due to time dilation, when you approach the speed of light, time slows down, while when you arrive at the speed of light, it stops. If you were to accelerate beyond the speed of light, then time would theoretically begin moving backwards, which will allow for effects that happen before the cause, thus violating causality. The speed of light then defines the limit at which matter, energy, and signals can travel, as previously explained. I could go on about the speed of light, but I've already explained most of what's relevant to this topic, so allow me to summarize it. Light is electromagnetic radiation within the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that is visible to us humans. All forms of electromagnetic radiation propagate at the universal speed limit known as the speed of light while within a vacuum. It is the speed of both causality and the rate at which information can travel. The reason the speed of light moves, well, at the speed of light, or approximately 300,000 kilometers a second, is because of two fundamental constants, known as vacuum permeability and vacuum permittivity. Now that all of that is out of the way, I'll explain my contentions. Firstly, everything I just explained goes to show that many people don't understand what light and light speed actually is and how it works, because if they did, they would already understand the problem with saying a character is moving faster than light. A way to quickly exemplify the problem with scaling characters to faster than light speed based on statements of an attack beam, a beam of light, or something akin to it is to ask, how are these characters moving faster than light, yet they can still see? As we all know, you need photons to perceive objects, so if they're moving faster than light, then how can they see anything? Secondly, when you say an ability is moving at the speed of light because it's called light or referred to as light, you're doing what is called an argument from analogy, which is a form of inductive reasoning where you basically say that since X thing has similar characteristics to another thing, then the other characteristics of that other thing must also be on this thing. Thus, if we see a character shoot a directional flow of something and it's referred to as light, we say that it's light and is moving at the speed of light. This is the line of reasoning behind this meta. However, now that I've explained what light is, scaling above it should be impossible since, for one, if you're moving faster than it, you wouldn't be able to see anything since the reason we can see is because of light. Thirdly, it's self-contradictory to say that you're moving faster than light while being made up of atoms, since the speed of light will inherently be above your thought speed. Fourthly, you cannot move faster than light since it's the limit at which information can travel, and traveling faster than it violates causality, which cannot happen. And even if it did happen, the character in question should be traveling backwards in time. Fifthly, light moves at the same speed in all reference frames. So if you were to look at a beam of light travel, you wouldn't be able to see it physically move regardless of how fast you were moving. Take someone turning on a flashlight for example. If they turn it on in front of you, you wouldn't be able to see the light travel from one location to another as it's projected from the flashlight. Thus, reacting to a beam of light is impossible and would be contradicting the principle of what light itself is. To simplify everything I just said, saying that something is moving at the speed of light and reacting to it or moving faster than the speed of light by scaling to something that is stated to be light directly contradicts the idea of what light is. Thus, you cannot use it to establish that said supposed beam of light is moving at the speed of light. Now, it should be noted that I'm not saying fictional characters cannot move faster than approximately 300,000 kilometers a second, which is the speed of light. What I am saying is that you cannot use something being stated to be light and try to scale them off of it, since in the vast amount of times, any application of light in fiction will be contradicted due to what light is. Since I know this can be complicated, another way to explain this argument would be like this. Let's say that I state I'm currently sleeping, but while claiming that I'm standing up. It's apparent that I'm not sleeping, as my current state directly goes against the definition of what sleeping is. Therefore, the claim that I am sleeping is false, as it's contradicted. The same logic is being applied here. Something that supports the statement this meta is based on our most likely hyperbolic is Gin, where in chapter 400, he stated that his Bankai moves at 500 times the speed of sound, which is heavily implied to be impressive. Take a look. Now some people may try to counter this by saying that Gin was referring to the speed at which his hand claps or at the speed at which his hand moves and not the sound it makes. The problem with this reasoning is that in the anime, it's very apparent that he was referring to the speed of sound, since Gin asked Ichigo did he hear that rather than ask him did he see that or something like that. Moreover, if he was just referring to the speed at which his hands were moving, why didn't he just swing his sword or something like that? Why would he perform a multitask action to ask Ichigo if he saw the speed at which his hand moved? Like, it just makes sense if he was talking about the sound generated by his clap rather than the speed at which his hands were moving. On top of what I just said, the word that Gin uses is todoita, which is generally used in reference to something arriving, such as a message, a package, or someone arriving at a specific location. However, in another context, it can be used in reference to someone hearing something or a sound arriving at their location. This word is never used in the context of someone seeing something, so it makes absolutely no sense for Gin to be talking about the speed at which his hands were moving. The cherry on top comes from the Unmasked data book, where while talking about the scene in which Gin claps his hand, it stated that the speed at which his Bankai extends and contracts is similar to the speed at which one can clap. Obviously referring to the speed of sound in this case, as the data book goes on to say that Gin's Bankai surpasses the speed of sound. What all of this means is that Mach 500 is supposed to be an impressive speed for pre-Dagai Ichigo. Now, I'm not saying that Ichigo caps at that speed, since with other forms of scaling, it's likely that the speed of sound in Bleach is higher than ours. But without this scaling, it goes to show that the author didn't intend for those statements about beams of light to be taken literal, as throughout this video, I've demonstrated that Kubo loves to use figurative language. Moreover, Kubo uses the speed of sound as a form of comparison rather than the speed of lightning or the speed of light, which just substantiates my previous claim. On top of all of that, while one data book calls Seiro's spiritual light, another will correct this and refer to them as just concentrated beams of spiritual pressure, which again goes to show that those statements about light are most likely figurative. In conclusion, I believe this method doesn't work because, as a general rule, you cannot scale Bleach, or any series for that matter, to the speed of light based on just a statement that an attack is a beam of light, a ray of light, or something similar to that, as doing so directly contradicts the principles of light, and it makes no logical sense to be able to move faster than light while also seeing things. It just means that scaling off of light because something is called light is fallacious. The sentiments about these statements being figurative are supported by Gin, who implies that Mach 500 is supposed to be impressive, and Kubo using the speed of sound as an impressive metric rather than the speed of lightning or the speed of light. Now that I have finally explained my contentions with 10 different methods people use to scale Bleach, allow me to summarize why I don't believe they work. Firstly, the high universal Starrk method doesn't work because the actual kanji that is used isn't the one for infinity, if not the one for countless, which tends to be used hyperbolically. But even if it was the kanji for infinity, its application has inverse problems that contradict the idea of infinity. Secondly, the size of the Soul King Palace and Seireitei meta doesn't work because the stated or calc size of these structures are too inconsistent to try to pinpoint an exact number on them and say that this is exactly how large they are, or that the true value is very close to this. Thirdly, the higher dimensional Aizen and Ichigo meta doesn't work because the statements themselves are contradicted if you take them as being literal. And it just makes more sense for it to be figurative speech, as the word dimension was used in a few chapters prior as a synonym for level or strength, such as how 10 is on another level than 1 due to it being 10 times its size. Fourthly, the Omnipotent Soul King meta doesn't work because it delves into the inherent problems with claims of omnipotence, and it's most likely just a use of figurative language, as there have been multiple statements like it in the past that were used figuratively, as speech in general integrates figures of speech, which is something that is even more prevalent in literature. Fifthly, the Planetary/Universal Sokyoku meta doesn't work because it's extraordinarily more likely that Aizen just lied about the Sokyoku to Hinamori so she will fight Toshido rather than his statement about it being true, as it isn't consistent with the later feats and statements and it just doesn't make sense in general. Sixthly, the state/stellar size of Las Noches meta doesn't work because Nell's statement is contradicted on numerous different occasions, and Las Noches having a star or a planet just doesn't make sense as the manga, anime, and data book straight up debunk it. Seventhly, the Universal Visionary meta doesn't work because you cannot prove that he is directly transferring his spiritual pressure into an amount of matter, rather than just using his spiritual pressure to produce an effect, as you know that sacred letters are things that you do not inherently scale to due to the way they are defined. Supporting this notion is that Grammy was able to amplify his strength, which shouldn't be possible if he was just using raw spiritual pressure. Eighthly, the Stellar Kido Canon meta doesn't work because you cannot prove that the realm was going to be destroyed as a result of just spiritual pressure, and the size of the realm is nowhere near the size of a solar system, let alone a planet or a satellite such as the moon. Ninthly, the Planetary/low multiversal Yhwach meta doesn't work because Yhwach had no reason to actually destroy the realms with his strength in a direct sense. If not, he planned to remove the cycle of souls between realms, which would have caused them to revert how they were previously, which would have destroyed them and made a differentiation between life and death. Lastly, the light speed attack method doesn't work because, as a general rule, you cannot scale Bleach, or any series for that matter, to the speed of light based on just a statement that an attack is a beam of light, a ray of light, or something similar to it, as doing so directly contradicts the principles of light, and it makes no logical sense to be able to move faster than light while also seeing things. Though it should be noted that this doesn't mean that characters in fiction cannot move faster than the speed of light. It just means that scaling a character off of the speed of light because its light is fallacious. The sentiment about the statement this meta is based on being figurative are supported by Gin, who implies that Mach 500 is supposed to be impressive, and Kubo uses the speed of sound as an impressive metric rather than the speed of lightning or the speed of light. And yeah, that's about all I wanted to say. This video took way too long to make, so y'all better like, subscribe, and follow me on all of my other socials, as the script for this video is over 10,500 words long. But yeah, that's about it. Bye.